Welcome to the Daily Coffee Pro by Mapper Forward, friends. So, you want to start your own coffee podcast, and it would surprise you to know perhaps how often we get asked this question of how should I go about creating my own coffee podcast? There are a lot of coffee podcasts out there, and there are a lot of people who believe that they should have a coffee podcast. I am of the belief that anybody who wants to have their own anything should have it. They should go about the business of creating it for themselves. So I'm going to answer a bunch of the W's around having a podcast. Who, why, when, what, and 1H, how. So let's get about defining who should have a coffee podcast. In my opinion, anybody who wants to have a podcast should have a podcast. I should warn you up front, it's nowhere near as easy as what you think it is, and it's nowhere near as straightforward as you think it is. This is my 10th year, 11th, 12th year maybe, podcasting. So podcasting is kind of in my blood now. This is not the only industry I've ever had a podcast in, and it's not the only industry I currently have a podcast in. I have another podcast called Love and Other Delusions, and it explores conversations navigating the grey across all the different spectrums of life. Now, doing podcasts comes a lot easier when you understand the logistics and the technical aspect of doing it, as well as having had the experience of knowing the framework of how you want to have a podcast. And I have had many different frameworks in the 4-5 podcasts that I've had over the past 12 years. Some of them have been live, some of them have been pre-recorded, some of them have been edited, most of them have not been edited. So who should have a podcast? Whoever wants to have a podcast. But you should, again, know that it is an involved process that requires a lot of time and effort. Why should you have a podcast? You should have a podcast if you have something you want to say, you have something you want to explore, you have something that you want to create or cultivate. Basically, what I'm saying is you should have a podcast if you have a reason for having a podcast. Now, if that reason is something like, I want to get famous, or I just want to do something that's going to get me attention, I'm going to burst your bubble there by saying that's not what a podcast easily achieves. And I know that there are a significant number of people who contact us that when I ask them why they want to have a podcast, their response is typically something like, well, I want to get famous. Getting famous with a podcast is extremely difficult. So again, I say the reason you should have a podcast is if you want to impart expertise that you have so that you can educate people, or if you want to learn about something and you can use the podcast as a platform or a mechanism for learning about something, about a niche part of the industry that you want to explore. Now, when should you do it? Okay, this is another one of those, well, whenever you want, but I will say do it when you are ready. And getting ready is the same for a podcast as launching any small business. Now, what that means is you should do it when you have an understanding of why you're doing it. You should do it when you have an understanding of how you're going to do it. You should do it when you know how you're going to activate a customer acquisition plan. So your customers being your listeners. You should do it when you understand what you want to get out of it. So just deciding today I'm going to do a podcast, announcing to the world I'm going to do a podcast, and then trying to figure out how you're going to do a podcast and when you're going to do it is not going to be a great strategy to releasing your podcast. I don't want that to be a barrier for you to doing something that you're incredibly passionate about. If this is something that you're passionate about, this is a really viable career option for somebody who needs to pivot out of a cafe or out of a roastery into an online business. It will, like I said, take a lot of work. And that takes me to the next thing that we should define here is how you do a podcast, how you create a podcast. You need to figure out, do I want this to be a video only podcast, an audio only podcast, or a video and audio podcast? What kind of content do I want to produce? What kind of supplementary content do I want to produce? So that would be, do I want to include links in the show notes? What kinds of links? Is it just backlinks to other people's content? Or will you be creating specific downloadable content? Are they going to be conversations? Are they going to be like this, the Daily Coffee Pro, where it's just 15 minutes of me throwing out ideas that I would invite you to ponder? How well is it going to be produced? What kind of technology will you need? What kind of equipment will you need? How will you look? How will you sound? How will you practice? How will you edit? How much editing do you want? All of these things are really important questions to be asking yourself as a precursor to figuring out how you will create your podcast. So you need to understand, once you've got the answers to those questions, what are the tools, the online tools, the physical tools, the educational tools that you'll need to engage so that you can execute on your business strategy with regards to content creation. Your product in this small business endeavor is your content. And your job is to build a customer acquisition plan that you can execute on that will get you enough of an audience that is valuable for a sponsor to advertise through your platform so that you can create a viable business model. Now, if financial gain, creating a job or creating a viable business is not one of the life currencies of the reason behind why you're creating a podcast. So if your podcast is building wealth in a different life currency of yours, figure out what that life currency is and figure out how the podcast can be a wealth building mechanism in that life currency. For example, if you are somebody who is building wealth in connectedness as one of your life currencies or community, figure out how you can use your podcast as a way to help you build wealth in that. Okay, so the final thing that we will be exploring about whether you should have your own podcast or not is, what are you going to get out of it? And again, this leans into life currencies. So understanding fundamentally what you are going to get out of having your podcast and how that's going to enhance your career, how it's going to enhance your business, how it's going to enhance your life is super, super important to have defined and understood so that you are motivated through all of the very hard work that's required to create, build, and cultivate a podcast that people want to listen to and want to engage in. One final note. Creating a product and putting it out there is a tiny, tiny part of the business journey. You'll need to figure out how to track your analytics. You'll need to figure out how to create a visually appealing product. You'll need to figure out how to market it, how to grow it, how to listen to your audience and provide content that not only they want to hear about, but you want to deliver. It can get very enticing to just deliver the content that gets you the most engagement. However, if you do that, you become, you don't become, your audience becomes the gatekeeper to the kind of information that you're putting out there. An example of that, whenever we put content out that specifically has the word coffee roaster in it, we know that content is going to spike. Now, if we just listen to the analytics and we only create content that we know is going to spike, then we will be going against the values of what our podcast stands for. Our podcast is a podcast for the entire coffee industry and the entire value chain. So if we just create content that gets absorbed by people who spike our numbers, coffee roasters, then we will be betraying what we stand for and why we are doing this, what we get out of this, and only providing content that a certain niche of our audience wants. So defining all of this, understanding all of it is a really important part to knowing why you have your product and what you're going to use it for and who is going to mostly use it. So I hope that's been helpful. I want to encourage anybody that wants to have a coffee podcast to go out there and do it. Give it a go and let us know that you are launching so that we can tune in. We are huge fans of the idea that everybody gets to rise if they at least have a go. If you don't have a go, you've got no chance at all. Good luck if you are thinking about starting a coffee podcast. And if you need help, consider joining one of our mastermind groups where we will help cultivate that in you and help you grow that business. Peace, love, and peanut butter, friends. Have an amazing rest of your day.